All right, y'all out there in audiobook land. This is Tony Denton coming to you from Phoenix, Arizona on this August the 21st, 2019. And I am ready to share with you lesson number 30 in my book, Hebrews from Flawed to Flawless Fulfilled, which begins on page 239 of the book if you have it and are following in that. This will be Hebrews chapter 11, the last section of it, verses 32 through 40. And I'll begin this one, just like I did the last three, with pretty much the same introductory material. In the previous section, Paul began displaying faith's hall of fame, wherein, per chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, he portrayed his Jewish Christian readers as runners in a race within the confines of a coliseum. And within the stadium seats were all the faithful who had run the race before them, cheering them on to victory. Here's the picture. Each generation of the faithful, at least from Abel, chapter 11, verse 4, to the fulfillment of the promise, chapter 11, 39 and 40, were in a relay race for the prize of reconciliation to God. In this scenario, the baton was in the hands of this first century and last generation of Jewish brethren, and they were on the verge of reaching the finish line. They were winning for all who had gone before them, and more, those of us who have come after them. When we view it in this manner, we can see how tremendously important it was that these brethren keep pressing on. It wasn't just for their salvation as individuals that they were running, but it was for each and every child of God before them and after them. Having begun this survey with Abel and making it through to Rahab, verses 4 through 31, it concludes in verses 32 through 40 with Paul's brief remarks about the various types of suffering that numerous other ancestors experienced. And, as he stressed earlier, then again, as this chapter closed, all these people endured their afflictions with only the hope of receiving the promised things, whereas those first century brethren were in the process of finally receiving them after 2,000 years of waiting since the promises were initially provided. So let's begin with verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, also of David and Samuel and the prophets. By posing the initial question here, Paul seemed to be asking, do I need to go on with my list? If he did need to go on, he indicated that he'd run out of time because there were so many faithful to God in their past, seemingly shaming them all the more for what they were becoming branded as, apostatizers. Check out chapter 10, verse 25 in its context. Paul went on to briefly allude to 5 judges, 1 king, and the many prophets of Israel in general. And why did he list these particular 6 individuals? Apparently because of the overwhelming odds that each of them faced, odds that required and, by faith, received God's assistance. So we'll look at Barak first. Barak was the one who, with only 10,000 soldiers, defeated the army of the Canaanite king, delivering Israel from 20 years of tyranny. How? By faith. But, as with Sarah, verse 11, Moses, verse 23, and Israel, verse 29, all who in these cases depended on the faith of someone else, it seems that Barak carried out his task by the faith of Deborah, Israel's 4th judge, Judges chapters 4 and 5. Sort of sounds as if Paul were implying that these brethren needed to help lean on one another. Chapter 10, verse 24-25, and chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. Well, whether that's the case tonight, let's move on to Gideon. Gideon, Israel's 5th judge, is known as the one who by faith defeated tens of thousands of Midianites with a mere 300 soldiers, Judges chapters 6 through 8. Jephthah, Israel's 9th judge, is known for his victories over the Ammonites, Judges chapters 11 and 12, and he specifically mentioned God's promises in chapter 11 of Judges, verses 23 and 24. Samson, Israel's 13th judge, is known for his victories over the Philistines, Judges chapters 13 through 16, victories that he believed were possible only because of his strength that came from the Lord. Then there's Samuel, Israel's 15th and last judge. He is known for being a very courageous and virtually perfectly faithful man, regardless of how immoral and idolatrous his circumstances were, 1 Samuel chapters 1 through 28. David, Israel's second and perhaps greatest king, is known very well for his faith in God, 1 Samuel 16 through 1 Kings chapter 1, especially in the case of his victory over Goliath and the Philistines. And by Paul merely saying, "and the prophets," he realized that these Hebrews knew of the faith of all these men all too well to even name them all. So, although none of these people were sinless, at critical times in their lives they boldly trusted God when the odds were against them. And through their obedience to the Lord, God saved his people. The same thing he would do for these Hebrews to whom Paul was writing. They just needed to trust and obey. Verses 33 and 34. Speaking of all these men just mentioned, Paul said, "who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and turned to flight the armies of the aliens." Joshua subdued the Canaanites, Gibeon subdued the Midianites, Jephthah subdued the Ammonites, and David subdued the Amalekites, Edomites, Jebusites, Moabites, Philistines, Syrians, and others. The phrase worked righteousness here could be translated as enforced justice, as the Revised Standard Version says, meaning that it likely has reference to leaders such as Samuel and David for being righteous in their execution of God's laws, 1 Samuel 12:4 and 2 Samuel 8 verse 15. Not only in Israel, but also among nations of a corrupt nature. Joshua and Caleb obtained the land of Canaan. Phinehas obtained an everlasting priesthood. And David obtained the promise of the kingdom of Israel. In fact, these all saw the fulfillment of promises concerning conquests, land, and children. Samson, David, Benaiah, and Daniel all survived encounters with lions, the most dreaded beast of their time and region. Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were delivered from a violent or powerful fire. Violence is from the Greek word dunamine, the word from which we get dynamite. The reading of this could mean that the faith of some quenched the power of a fire, even though they weren't saved like the three Hebrew children. Moses escaped the sword of Pharaoh. Elijah escaped the sword of Ahab. Elisha escaped the sword of Jehoram. David escaped the sword of Saul, and Jeremiah escaped the sword of Jehoiakim. Abraham defeated 4 kings with only 318 men. Gideon defeated tens of thousands of Midianites with only 300 men. Samson took out a city all by himself. And David defeated the colossal Philistine champion with a stone. As Jonathan once said, "Nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few," 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6. Courage in battle not only can be clearly seen in all the victories referred to, but one can also find numerous others in the books of Joshua and Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The clause, "turn to flight the armies of the aliens," reads better as, "put foreign armies to flight," Revised Standard Version. In other words, when nations such as the Ammonites, Assyrians, Moabites, and Philistines attempted to invade Israel's territory, they were made to retreat. How? By faith in Yahweh. Alright, verse 35. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. There were at least 2 women who received their dead to life again. Elijah brought back the child of the widow of Zarephath, 1 Kings 17:17-24, and Elisha brought back the child of the woman of Shunem, 2 Kings 4:18-37. In opposition to verse 34 about many escaping a sword, this verse indicates that God didn't always choose to save the faithful. Many died of their torture, but even they died in faith. They thought as Job, who said, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him," chapter 13, verse 15 of Job. And the 3 Hebrew children, who said that even if God didn't deliver them, they would still serve him, Daniel 3:17 and 18. The original word for tortured is from the same root term as the English word timpani, a kettle drum. So the particular torture to which this referred involved stretching a victim over a large kettle drum apparatus and beating him with clubs until he either denied his God or he was pronounced dead, or both. So how could anyone read this verse about Old Testament saints enduring torture for their faith and not see the relevance of it for the Hebrews to whom Paul was writing in their first generation time of severe persecution? When Paul wrote of a better resurrection, the question is, a better resurrection than what resurrection? The answer, of course, is the biological temporal one that the sons of these women experienced. And what would be better than that? Logically, the opposite of physical, namely a spiritual one. One in which the reconciliation of fellowship to their Creator in the heavenly country is enjoyed. Verse 16. By the way, something interesting about this verse 35, is that it confirms that Old Testament saints believed in the promise of a resurrection of some sort. And it appears that it wasn't necessarily one of a physical, thus temporary nature, but one that is better than that. And remember, the key term better throughout Hebrews is a contrast word for the blessings of the new covenant as distinguished from the lack thereof under the old covenant. Verse 36. Still others had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, and of chains and imprisonments. While some were tortured to death on the tympany, there were others who lived to endure an enormous amount of torture of various other sorts. Many suffered the emotional anguish of mockings and the physical anguish of scourgings, incidents which generally led to chains and imprisonments. Thus Paul covered the entire spectrum. Those who escaped death, verse 34, those who died during torture, verse 35, and those who suffered at length, verse 36. Samson was ridiculed, imprisoned, and had his eyes bored out by the godless Philistines, Judges chapter 16, 21, and 25. Worse still, God's prophets, like his own son, of course, were scorned by their own people, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 16. Joseph was falsely accused and imprisoned by Pharaoh, Genesis 39:20. The prophet Micaiah was beaten by Zedekiah and imprisoned with only bread and water by Ahab, 1 Kings 22, verses 24 and 27. And the prophet Hanani was imprisoned in rage by Asa, 2 Chronicles 16 and 10. There was one man who endured all of these and more. Not only was Jeremiah mocked by everyone, Jeremiah chapter 20 verse 7, beaten, chapter 20 verse 2, chapter 37 verse 15, put in chains, chapter 20 verse 2, and placed in prison, chapter 32 verse 2, and chapter 32 verse 2 and 37 verse 15, but he was also put in a dungeon, a waterless well of sludge, into which he sank, chapter 38 verse 6. What was so bad about poor Jeremiah's case, as with many other cases, is that nearly all of the tragedies he suffered were at the hands of his own people whom he was merely trying to help. Likewise, the people to whom Paul was writing at this time, AD 63 through 65, were experiencing most of their suffering at the hands of their own Jewish brethren. The question was, would they respond like Jeremiah and their other numerous ancestral heroes of faith? Verse 37. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. Naboth was falsely accused and stoned to death, 1 Kings 21, 13 and 14. And the prophet Zechariah was stoned to death for his warnings from God, 2 Chronicles 24, 20 through 22. Clark wrote, that is Adam Clark, the commentator, that in a Jewish source called the Yevamot, it is written that Manasseh slew Isaiah, for he commanded that he be slain with a wooden saw. They then brought the saw and cut him in two, and when the saw reached his mouth, his soul fled forth. That is, his life left him. The oldest manuscript we have of Hebrews doesn't include the phrase, were tempted. Check out Ralph Earl's word meanings in the New Testament, which is why many versions don't include it in this verse. However, if it's accepted as genuine, then it probably has reference to the relentless torture referred to in verse 35, which no doubt included coercion, perhaps even threatening family members in the victim's presence, to deny their faith and turn to idols. Check out Daniel chapters 3 and 6, where men were punished for not worshiping something or someone other than Yahweh. By the way, there were severe consequences for anyone who tried to compel God's people to worship anything or anyone except Yahweh, Deuteronomy 13, 6 through 11. Saul had many of God's people killed by the sword for being on David's side, 1 Samuel 22, 17 through 19. The prophet Uriah was slain with the sword, Jeremiah 26, 20 through 23. And Elijah spoke about Jezebel killing many of God's prophets with the sword, 1 Kings 19 and 10. This coincidentally brings up the next thought. Just as the one man, Jeremiah, so perfectly epitomized verse 36, so the one man, Elijah, being destitute, afflicted, and tortured, by Jezebel perfectly epitomizes much of verse 37. Because he was driven from his home by Jezebel, 1 Kings 19:3-14, Elijah was destitute and so had to wear sheepskin. Check out 2 Kings 2:13, etc., where the Septuagint has the same Greek term as here in Hebrews. This is probably why he was called a hairy man in 1 Kings 1 and verse 8, not, as supposed by painters, because he had an enormously long beard. Paul used the same term for afflicted, 2 Corinthians 4:8, when he said that the apostles were hard-pressed on every side. One can't read the story of Elijah without at least partially feeling the torment he unjustly endured from Jezebel and Ahab, all because he, like John the Baptist, the New Testament Elijah, who also wore hairy clothing, stood for Yahweh against the rulers of Israel. Verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy, that is, of all those men he just mentioned. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. The idea that the world was not worthy of such people implies that there were those who were not only in the world but also of the world, while there were those who were in the world but were not of the world. Check out, of course, John 15:19 and John 17:14-16. After the Apostle Paul spoke in his defense before the Jews in Jerusalem, they said, away with such a fellow from the earth, for he is not fit to live, Acts 22:22. Meaning that they considered men like him as merely sheep for the slaughter, Romans 8:36. That's man's opinion. But if one were to ask God his thoughts on the matter, he'd say just the opposite. The world was not worthy of such fellows. Check out Romans 8, verses 33 and following. Probably with Elijah in mind, Paul reminded his readers where these wanderers wandered and lived. They wandered in deserts and mountains and lived in caves and holes. When Jezebel pursued Elijah, he hid in a mountain cavern, 1 Kings 19:9, and when Jezebel was killing the prophets of God, Obadiah hid 100 of them in caves, only able to feed them with bread and water, 1 Kings 18:4. Now let's don't forget about poor David hiding in a cave from Saul, 1 Samuel 24, verse 3. Surely all this makes one wonder about the veracity of the health and wealth doctrine, does it not? Okay, verse 39. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. Just as Paul began this chapter by speaking of how God indicated his approval of people who lived and even died in faith, verses 2, 4, and 5, so here he ended it by speaking of the same. Not only did these saints receive God's approval in their faithfulness, by which they gained a good reputation among the saints, but, as Paul also wrote in verse 13, they did so without receiving the fulfillment of the promise, that is, the promise of the Messiah, his covenant, and his kingdom. They did receive some of the things promised to Abraham, verse 33, but not this particular promise. An interesting thought here is that, although the promise of a spiritual land or the eternal kingdom and life through the Messiah is usually associated with Abraham alone, those before him, Abel, Enoch, Noah, etc., were included, meaning that Paul could have very well had Genesis 3:15 in mind, where God said to the serpent, probably in earshot of Adam and Eve, so they would pass it down to their children, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall wound your head, and you shall bruise his heel. All these saints pleased God because they not only believed he existed, but that he also would reward those who diligently sought after him. Verse 6. In other words, they were convinced that he would indeed fulfill his promises, promises that involve the reward of deliverance from sin and its consequent death. All right, verse 40. Last verse. God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. The phrase something better refers to New Covenant life as opposed to Old Covenant death, chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. This is the better thing that Paul had been discussing all along. Check out verse 35. The word perfect means complete here, indicating that the Lord's imminent arrival, chapter 10, verse 37, to fulfill the promise, chapter 10, verse 36, of the time of Reformation, chapter 9, verse 10, or the times of restoration, Acts 3:21, would bring to completion the plan of God for reconciliation to all mankind. Another important RE word is right here in this context, something without which reformation, restoration, and reconciliation wouldn't be possible. The word is resurrection, verse 35. It's the better thing because it's what makes perfect. Then Paul said of their ancestors that they should not, or would not, which is what the NLT, NIV, and NASB say, that is, they would not be made perfect apart from us, meaning that the reconciling of the Jews, yea, the entire world, would not be apart from or without the first generation saints, the remnant, or the elect, the ones who lived in those days of fulfillment. See, it was God's plan that all of this be worked out over a long period of earthly time, and now these Hebrew brethren were experiencing the fulfillment of it all. As Paul wrote in Ephesians 1:10, that in the dispensation of the fullness of the times he might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth. In Luke 10:23 and 24, Jesus said to his disciples, "Blessed are the eyes that see what you see, for I tell you that many prophets and kings have desired to see what you see and haven't seen it, and to hear what you hear and have not heard it." And in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, Peter wrote, "To them it was revealed that, not to themselves but to us, they were ministering the things which have been reported to you, things angels desire to look into." So, emphasize that. Not to them, but to us, Peter said, in that generation. Thus, these Hebrews should have been excited over what they were experiencing, namely a being raised to fellowship life, which would culminate at Jesus' AD 70 consummation of all things. They, that generation, was finally receiving the fulfillment of everything, and they, of all people, of all generations of their people, needed to hang in there until it was all over with. Okay, now let's finish up by going to page 321 if you have the book, and I'll read to you these verses from my translation that we just studied. Chapter 11, verse 32 through verse 40. Must I continue? Time will fail me if I go on telling about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David, as well as Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and received the fulfillment of the promises. They stopped the mouths of lions, quenched flames of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, and routed foreign armies. Women regained their dead by means of resurrection, while others, with the promise of a better resurrection, refused freedom from death by torture. Still others experienced trials of mockings and scourgings, even many times resulting in being bound and imprisoned. They were pressed to commit sin. They were stoned and sawn in half. They were murdered by the sword, clothed in skins of sheep and goats. They were driven from place to place in poverty, oppression, and cruelty, making them wander about in deserts and mountains, dwelling in caves and holes in the ground. The world was not worthy of them. And yet all these, although having been commended for their faith, didn't receive the fulfillment of the promise, because God had reserved the better resurrection for us, meaning that these departed saints could only experience this goal in concert with us. What does that teach except that the resurrection promised in Daniel chapter 12 would occur around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, Daniel 12 verse 7, Daniel 12 verse 2. Wasn't that what Paul was teaching? That the resurrection would be to those folks to whom he wrote, to that generation. What a wonderful chapter 11 of Hebrews, and what a wonderful last section, verses 32 through 40. Thank you for being with me this week. And I look forward to sharing with you more next week when we begin chapter 12, and we'll look at just verses 1 through 3. Besides chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, that is the only other section in the entire book of Hebrews where I only spent time on 3 verses. Again, thank you for your time, and have a great week.